You can use add and down.
All righty. Hello, everyone. My name is Edouard Tahmizian. I'm one of the board of directors of Internet Infidels, and I serve on their kiosk editorial review committee, and I'm a library author on a piece on the origin of evil. And today we are going to be interviewing the legendary Dominic Crossan, who used to be a co-chair for the Jesus Seminar. And to give a brief introduction to this excellent gentleman, Dominic Crossan, born February 17th, 1934 in Agag, Ireland, Irish-born American theologian and former Roman Catholic priest, best known for his association with the Jesus Seminar, an organization of revisionist biblical scholars, and his controversial writings on the historical Jesus and the origins of Christianity. Upon graduating from high school in Letterkenny, Ireland in 1950, Crossan joined the Servites, a Roman Catholic monastic order, and moved to Chicago. Ordained a priest in 1957, he returned to Ireland to study at St. Patrick's College, Maynooth, and received a doctorate in theology in 1959. He then studied at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome for 2 years before returning to his Servite community to teach. In 1965, he began to study at the École Biblique et Archéologie Française de Jerusalem, which is French Institute of Bible and Archaeology, Jerusalem, which was run by the Dominican order. 2 years later, he returned to Chicago to join the faculty of the Chicago Catholic Theological Union. In 1969, he resigned from the Servite priesthood, citing a longing for academic freedom and his intention to marry Marguerite de Gagnas, a professor at Loyola University, Chicago, then married that year. He soon joined the Faculty of Religious Studies at Chicago's DePaul University, where he taught until his retirement in 1995. After his retirement, Crossan continued to write and lecture, and this is all from biography and facts on Dominic Crossan from Encyclopedia Britannica. And before we get into the questions, sir, did you want to say anything real quick?
No, except I would have to say, teasingly, that your pronunciation is an awful job.
Oh, I know.
Okay, my late
how do you say it?
Margaret Dagenet. It's French. Look, I'm just having fun with you. Go ahead.
It's all right. Yeah, I know. I got to brush up on my French. Yeah, when I first read that, I was like, whoa. All righty.
All right. Forget it.
It's all good. I gave it a shot. Oh, and I just wanted to say, Mr. Crossan, and I wanted to say to everyone who's going to be viewing this that, do you remember your debate with Dr. James White from Alpha and Omega Ministry years back?
I do.
Yeah. And I wanted to say, like, he's a pretty formidable debate opponent who doesn't speak like fondly of his opponents. But I remember when you were talking with him, he was like, hey, this guy's one guy who's like several IQ points higher than everyone else. I respect this guy. So I was like, to get that from James White really goes to show, how much he respected you. So I remember that debate. And that was a really good debate on the historicity of Jesus and like the can we rely on the Gospels and stuff. So I really like that. Awesome. All righty. So to go off with our first question, can you tell us about your book, Resurrecting Easter? How the West lost and the East kept the original Easter vision. What are some of the key takeaways from the book?
Okay, the background real fast. For 15 years, from about 2000 to 2015, Sarah and I went all over the Byzantine world, all the way from France to Syria. We managed to get into Syria about 2010, about the last year you could get in with that and come out in one piece. Everywhere we went, what we were interested in is the way that Eastern Christianity depicts frescoes, everything, the resurrection. Whatever you think about it, they depict it. Over here, the West does it now. When we first ran into it, we didn't go there to look, by the way. We were there for other reasons. We were there to study Paul in Turkey. We began to see everywhere we went, we see this life of Jesus on the churches, and of course we recognize all the scenes. Who wouldn't? You know them. And then we see the crucifixion. Okay, yeah. we know what that is. And right next to it is an image that's supposed to be the resurrection. It says anastasis in Greek. It says it on it very often, and I know enough Greek to know that means resurrection. But it sure ain't the sight that we expected, which is Jesus coming out of the tomb, looking a bit like a stud coming out of the the gym, gorgeous, magnificent, beautiful muscles, Superman without the cloak. We said, wait a minute. In the Western tradition, it's all about individual Jesus, very Western, of course. In the East, it's all about he's coming out and he's taking Adam and Eve by the hand. Now, forget, for the moment, whether we're taking this metaphorically or literally, but Adam and Eve is a human race in the biblical tradition. If I want to show the whole human race, it gets a bit crowded if I try and show everyone. So Adam and Eve will do me, like Uncle Sam or John Bull will do for the whole country. So the problem, we started there. Why do we have such different images? Then it escalated from there backwards into the Bible, because I was interested in the Bible. I'm not doing art history. I really am it. So the question then became, well, if we had St. Paul here with us and we said, say the Corinthians instead of Paul, okay, we've read this thing you sent us, which we call 1 Corinthians. We've read chapter 15. You wouldn't know that, of course, but we've read this weird stuff you have about, the resurrection. We know what the crucifixion is like. You've always been talking about that. Well, you don't have to describe it. We've seen it. Now, this resurrection stuff, Paul, would you mind drawing us a picture? Just so we know, how do you imagine it? I know you weren't there, Paul, but, you're imagining crucifixion. You weren't there either. So if you had to draw it, that's really the basic question of the book. Would Paul have drawn something like the Western individual resurrection or the Eastern universal resurrection? And then going back deeper into it, we ask this question. Supposing you take, and you can take it literally or metaphorically for the moment, that on Easter Sunday, as we call it, close followers of Jesus had visions. Now, I consider visions nothing supernatural, by the way. Vision is no more supernatural than a dream. Now, what you find in your dreams, that's another question, but dreams are dreams. They're not hallucinations.
Yeah.
I wake up at night and, because a giant is in the room with an axe going to kill me, and I wake up screaming, I look around and my poor wife, who's been, says, it's a dream, it's a dream. And okay. Now, if I call ADT and the police because there's a monster in my room with an axe, I've had an hallucination. I've lost touch with reality. So I can understand visions. It doesn't prove for me there's somebody out there. I take them seriously. I want to know the result of your vision. If you told me it is that you should sacrifice your firstborn son, I'm going to call 911 immediately. Even if so they had visions. Now, here's the big question, and it's an historical question. In the first century, for people who wanted to understand the vindication of Jesus, let me use a very neutral term, there was two options. I consider them both metaphors, by the way.
Okay.
One was ascension. Jesus is taken up to God. That would not have raised an eyebrow anywhere in the Greco-Roman or Jewish world. It could happen. I might believe that your guy was up there, but the Romans all believed that Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus was up there. So if I said Jesus is up there, they might say, we don't believe your guy is important enough. They couldn't say it couldn't happen. Yeah. And I couldn't say either, it only happened to our Jesus. Okay. So that's one route they could have gone. They could have claimed ascension. Jesus is up there with God, so we better do what he tells us, like the Roman Empire. Augustus is up there, so he's protecting us. That was not a claim that anyone in the first century would have been surprised at. It's like you and I could make a claim that our doctor is the best one in the world. Okay, somebody else could deny it, but he could be. Mm-hmm. It's in our possibilities. Now, the other possibility, here's where we get really difficult stuff. It's not ascension, which is apotheosis. The Greek word for ascension is apotheosis, divining. The other word is anastasis, which means resurrection. Mm-hmm. And that is a weird word. It is only understood and accepted within Pharisaic Judaism, not in the whole cultural world, not in all of Judaism, only among Pharisees. Remember, Paul was a Pharisee. What does it mean? It was a belief that arose, I can always put a date on it, in the 160s BCE, 160s before Jesus, that, hey, this world is unjust. And you can't keep telling us like the Deuteronomist does that if you're punished, if you're suffering, you'll be punished for your sin. And if you're good, you'll be rewarded. They said, how does that work for martyrs? This is the Maccabean martyrs. So we can date it. People said, where's the justice of God if I'm looking at the brutalized, tortured, executed body of a martyr?
Yeah.
Don't tell me he's been punished for his sins. So in 160, he said, okay, there has to be some great future cleanup of the world where God, they're not really worrying, am I going to live forever? The answer to that in Judaism for over 1,000 years was, no, you won't. Get over it. You're going to go down to Sheol, which is a great big condominium of graves beneath the earth. It's over. Get over it. Now they have a problem. And the problem is the justice of God. Yeah. Or if you want to say the justice of the world or the universe. If somebody dies to be faithful to God, where is the justice? So they came up with it. Now it's a brand new idea in Judaism, in the history of the world, to put it bluntly, that someday in the future, in days to come, at the end of days, fact, God is going to have a great judgment for the whole world. And everyone who's ever lived will be judged good or bad, and then will go to heaven or hell.
Gotcha.
Okay. That's their, now you and I can say, okay, get over it, but that's their faith. It makes sense to them. It didn't make sense to everyone, by the way. Not in the first century, everyone wasn't a Pharisee. The Sadducees didn't accept it. So now, here's Paul's problem. Jesus has, let me use the vague word, I'm using Easter deliberately to avoid resurrection.
Okay.
Jesus has been vindicated by God, using a neutral term. Because he was too holy, he was the Son of God, he was the Messiah, whatever reason, he had to be vindicated. Now, I go one of two routes. I can say, therefore, he's ascended, therefore, he's resurrected. But if I say, I'm a good Pharisee now, I believe in the resurrection, by the way. I believe at the end of time, there's going to be this great big judgment, blah, blah, blah. But there's no concept in Judaism whatsoever of an individual resurrection. That's like us having a nation of one.
Oh, yeah.
You say, we the people, but that can't be me. It can't begin by saying, me the people, I the people. So Paul has to come up with a brand new idea that the resurrection is not an event at the end of time, but a process through time. Now, wait a minute. Paul, that's what he says in 1 Corinthians 15. It's like the first fruits, the beginning of the harvest. Now, if the resurrection has begun, then here's where I'm pushing Paul validly. But then Paul, the general judgment has begun. And that means heaven and hell has begun. So Paul, we're not talking about the beginning of the resurrection and then the end sometime in the future, and everything in between is just Paul, of course, expects Christians to be resurrected people. That's the logic of his demands. You are resurrected people. And I'm saying to him, then that means, Paul, the general judgment has begun, heaven and hell has begun. And here's now where I say, I consider that to be absolutely true, not because of Christianity or Paul or anything else, but because of evolution. We are on a process of either destroying ourselves, and that's what I call the great, I don't believe for a second, let me be clear, that at some moment, some supernatural being is going to sit on a throne and do all of that. But I believe absolutely there is a final judgment on our species, Homo sapiens, within this natural secular world, whatever you want. And every day when we mess up our environment and make it more unlivable, we are moving, every single one of us, by everything we do. So there will be a great big, I'm not being apocalyptic or dramatic, a great big judgment on our species, Homo sapiens, within the universe. I don't know if evolution would let us get away with it. They might pull a super COVID on us to cool us off for a bit, saying, okay, you're globalizing greed now, and injustice is now globalization for the whole world. Good. Now we'll show you what some of the globalization means. And bugs can travel too. So I accept actually the vision of the New Testament, not in any literal sense that God's going to sit on the throne and do this, that, and the other, but that they're seeing something that is absolutely true. They're seeing the challenge to the human species, and no other species has, because we have conscience. We can know what we're doing. The gazelles might be doing it on the Serengeti plain. They might be driving themselves into extinction, but they don't know better. They're just doing by instinct.
Yeah.
We have conscience. So the whole point of the resurrection book is to ask people, don't take it literally, because it's, I don't know what word. That's the only, how would I put this? That is their way of saying it in the first century. I see that as a giant metaphor for the destiny of the human race. They're glimpsing something. Glimpsing. I am presuming that people in the first century weren't idiots. And when they were trying to explain the Roman Empire and why it's doing so well, for them to say that Augustus is up there in heaven, working everything, made absolute sense. Now, if the whole thing went down the tubes, as it did eventually, then nobody's talking about Augustus up in heaven. So the last Roman emperor in the West, Romulus Augustulus, was sent off to the Riviera in exile, and we got on with business in the European Union, as it were. So what interests me absolutely is where the biblical tradition and evolution, and I'm using evolution in the sense that everyone who knows about it means it. I'm not using it in some special Christian sense or anything else. I'm using it the way I don't fully understand. I use it the way that I looked at your web, and you see that person who wrote on there about being awed by looking at evolution.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as far as I'm concerned, I take that as looking and experiencing God, but not this theistic God. And not, by the way, the atheistic God, because the atheist is trapped in theism. They're locked in a dance together. I say, forget it. We're not talking about a supernatural being at all. We're talking about what happens when a human being, us, ordinary human being, knows about evolution, knows about the Big Bang, and looks calmly into the Big Bang and says, oh my God, it's still banging out there. Mm-hmm. It wasn't just something that happened. It's a process.
Yeah.
So when I look at the Big Bang, for example, I see three things that are mystery. They're not a person. I have no imagination whatsoever of a God back there, running the Big Bang like a puppet.
Gotcha.
Show. But what happens for me is three things. There is being rather than nothing. That's awesome. There's being rather than nothing. I don't know why there's not nothing. And it's not a puzzle for me. I figured that the physicists will figure out for me.
Yeah.
But secondly, equally important for me, being is dynamic. It could be static. I don't know why it's not static. Why isn't everything just there?
Uh-huh.
I'm looking at my Apple computer, and I can trust it that it won't go flying off into the air unless we have an earthquake, and then it will. So there's being is dynamic. And a third thing is equally important for me.
Uh-huh.
And I know I'm risking being a little Trinitarian. That dynamic is absolutely fair and just. Now, not my categories. I would not give viruses their freedom. If I was in control of the universe, they'd stay in their own little place, wherever it is, on a deserted island. But evolution is absolutely fair to the physical world to do what it has to do. So what we call a natural disaster is simply the mountains forming or whatever. And the same with the animals. So I want to say being is there, dynamic and just, fair, whatever term you want to use. So I have no problem with thinking about the universe as a closed system. I have great difficulties with our ability to mess up our Earth and maybe destroy ourselves. So that's what I'm really interested in, much more than if I didn't see the biblical tradition tracking, running like a train on the evolutionary rails, I would just consider it some nice kind of weird ideas that people got once upon a time, and you could study them if you wanted, like you would any other weird thing that in the past that you don't have to take seriously. But I take it seriously because I think they glimpse something. Not in my language. I wouldn't put it in that language. I wouldn't talk about the Son of God. That's not my language.
Okay.
But I would talk about somebody who might have a warning for the human race about their species problems, not their Jewish or Roman or Irish or American problems. The problems you have as a species, that you are, this is my language now, not Jesus's, you are the only collective species with individual wills.
Yes.
You really think the bees or the termites would be doing well if they had individual wills? And termite A could decide, nah, I'm going this way. The swarm's going that way. Nah, I'm going this way. I'm going that way. The termites would not be still around to be like the Congress. Huge motion with no progress. So that's really where I'm coming from. Now, that went widely, but to understand me, and it's within that matrix that I'll answer any other question. That was a long-winded one, I know, Ed.
Oh, hey, no, that was a great answer. Awesome. All righty. Well, thank you for that, sir. All righty. So moving to our second question, do you subscribe to the penal substitutionary atonement model of the cross of Jesus? Why or why not?
I think it is one of the most, let me be blunt, and I know this may offend some people, obscene theological mistake in the history of theology. I mean, there's been a lot of, the inquest was another one. We all make terrible mistakes, and we can also go through the American history if you want more mistakes. I understand how it happened, though. It happened in the late, just before the year 1200. Anselm of Canterbury, who I respect tremendously, by the way. He was one of the greatest spiritual directors in England, but he was a Norman. Now, I'm Irish. The Normans arrived, I think, what was it, 1050, I think, no, 1066. The Normans arrived in England as a conquering empire in 1066. They hit Ireland in 1166. I know those dates from history. Okay, so William the Conqueror comes in. The second one is also his son. They took Anselm and made him the Archbishop of Canterbury. To be fair, he's like a quisling archbishop. They made him archbishop. His big problem was this: the First Crusade was going on. He was against it, to his honor. The idea of going over and killing Muslims and Jews along the way, he thought was awful. He said what we should do is debate and argue with them. So he said, I'm going to debate with Muslims and Jews. That's his well-known book, Cur Deus Homo, Why Was God a Human Being? And he says, I'll debate with them. Now, he said, I can't argue from scripture. If I pull up scripture, they go, oh, we don't follow that. So I have to argue from reason alone. All right. How does he argue from reason alone? He says, now watch his metaphor. Once you grant him this metaphor, you lost the game. God is the supreme judge of the universe. Why did he choose judge? He was an abbot, he was a spiritual director, he was running monasteries. If you're an abbot and you're running a monastery and you operate on substitutionary atonement, you'll have an empty monastery. Your job as an abbot is to bring people to holiness, not just to punish. He chose a judge, and the reason he did that because that was the vaunted claim of the Normans to you savage Anglo-Saxons. We brought you justice. The Romans said it all over the world. We brought you Roman justice. They told the Irish, you're all savages over here. We're coming across the Irish Sea to bring you justice. Law and order is this euphemism. So here's what he said. God is a judge. Now, we all know that no judge can walk into court, I'm putting it in my language, and say, I'm feeling merciful, you're all forgiven. Yeah, I have to agree. We know that if a federal judge walked into court and said, everyone is forgiven today, I'm feeling merciful, he'd be disbarred or whatever. So I have to grant him that. If God is the judge of the universe, somebody has to be punished for crime. Otherwise, here's this key verse: God does not care about evil. I concede him that. Debating with Anselm, I said, but why do you think God is a judge? What if you went not with Deuteronomy 28, which is where God is a judge? You went with Genesis 1, where God creates human beings in God's own image and likeness, and there's nothing about punishments. But if you're created in God's own image and likeness and don't act accordingly, what happens? Well, let's test it. Go up to the 30th story of a building and think you're a bird. Tell me what happens. Did God punish you by hitting you with the pavement? No, you acted
Stupid, yeah.
You acted stupid. So if he had taken that image, it's a different image. I'm not arguing for it. I'm just saying, if you get with God, the creator, who shared God's own being with us. I'm playing it now within the Bible. For the moment, you can imagine God as a super person if you want to. But this super person has given us a participation in the super person, which means I have to act accordingly, the same way as I act from my genes, my Irish accent, and everything else. I probably could get rid of it, would be a lot of work. So I would say God is a creator. God's distributed God's own self to me. If I don't act accordingly, I will bring disaster to myself. I'm not going to be punished. God's not a judge. It's as simple as the difference for me between, I'm using this very careful language, a consequence and a punishment. Not the way parents use it when they say consequences and mean punishments. If a drunken driver crashes into a tree and is killed by the impact, that's a consequence. It flows naturally from the event. If the drunken driver hits a tree and is fined by the police, that's a punishment. Now, in the Bible, you have, of course, in the Torah, in the first book, the first chapter of the Bible, which was written to be the first chapter of the Bible. Genesis 1 was not written, and then in Genesis 2, Genesis 3, Genesis 4. Was when they were assembling the Bible, like I'm finishing a book right now. Everything is accepted by my editor. We're discussing the prologue. Shouldn't that have been written 2 years ago? Of course not. The purpose of the prologue is that you're going to see the book through the eyes of the prologue. So my editor and I have gone backwards and forwards on the prologue. Genesis 1 is not the first chapter. It's the prologue, the overture, the spectacles through which you see the whole Bible. That's what they put it there when the Bible was being assembled after the Babylonian exile. So basically, I do not look and Anselm dear at Deuteronomy 28, which you're looking at, which clearly says that God will punish you if you disobey and reward you if you obey. If that's clear, that's in the Bible. And the Bible has all sorts of stuff based on that. Of course, people get punished. People, and in fact, Jesus has even asked, who sinned that this guy got born blind? They're thinking. The person today who after the hurricane passes and says, what did I do to deserve this? They may be a happy atheist, but you feel, I didn't do anything to deserve this. I look at my neighbor, wasn't even touched. And the neighbor says, I'm truly blessed. Well, if you're blessed, then he's cursed. So this is the point at which this whole divine punishment rewards becomes obscene.
Yeah.
It really is in its implications, because then I can feel great. And then I have people writing books. Why do bad things happen to good people?
Yeah.
They don't come from God. They come from, please don't build your house in a floodplain. The people in the Nile knew that. Every year the flood comes, don't build it in the floodplain. If you do, don't say the gods are punishing you. Now, they couldn't understand all sorts of other things like hurricanes and tornadoes or volcanoes. And so that could be maybe a punishment for God because it was so erratic. But evolution has answered that problem for us. It really has. We're living in a world which is like we're forming. Everything is forming. That's because evolution is dynamic. It could be different. I don't know how it would be different, but if we were all just here and I guess nothing happened, nothing changed. So when I look at penal substitution, I think it's really bad theology. I'm trying to be gentle now. Really bad theology. Because first of all, it destroys God. If this is God, then I am facing the position with God. Let's imagine, with a super being like this. Then I feel I'm under somebody like Hitler. Now, if I'm under Hitler, I may not be brave enough to stand up and say what I think, but I would hope, at least in my mind, I know this is obscene. I know it. Maybe I haven't the courage to say it. Maybe I won't have the courage to act on it. But I do hope, if I'm ever faced with obscene power or abusive power or a vision of power which is homicidal, they do know it. Don't join it. Don't do anything to support it. If this was what everyone believed about God, so that I'd have to say, well, this seems to be what this God is, then you would have to absolutely oppose it. You'd be bound to it. Now, the trouble is, of course, you're liable then to get trapped in that and think that's somehow normative. That's the danger of atheism. Then here's the theist who takes a supernatural being who's outside creation and controlling everything and loves it. Here's the atheist who hears all of that and hates it.
Yeah.
But I have accepted your vision. I just think your vision is wrong, absurd, whatever term I want to use. I use harsher language, I use the word obscene. So with all due respect, that's not the vision of the Bible. That's not what I find in there. I do find punishment, that's quite there. But that the whole world depends on this, that is not in there. That's not how Jesus redeems us. Now, that raises, of course, a huge question. What's the cross about? What's resurrection about? And all of them. Those are real questions. But when I get into those questions, the way I approach is I never, ever start with the New Testament. That's theology. Nothing wrong with that. But theology is an understanding, an interpretation of history. That's like you and I, if you were to say, let's say, I'm trying not to, I'm going to use a political analogy and I don't want to walk into a minefield. If you said President Obama, let me use that statement, was the greatest president that ever lived, and I were to say, no, I think he was the worst president that ever lived, we would have to admit those are both interpretations.
Yeah.
The fact we'd have to admit, I would hope, is that he was a president.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose if you push it and say that's something else, he was illegit. But let's imagine a gospel is good news.
Mm-hmm.
So anyone who puts the word gospel is not only telling me it's an interpretation, but it's a positive interpretation. So I look at the gospel and I say, okay, it's told me what it is. I see history in there, but certainly it's about Jerusalem and all the rest. I see biography in there. I do think Jesus exists. I do think that as a historian. But looking at them simply as a historian, they're telling me they're good news. So I'm now looking at that as interpretation, positive interpretation. Second thing I look at them, there's 4 of them. There's the gospel according to Mark, according to Matthew, according to Luke, according to. They're even honest enough to say, this is what happened. They have 4 of them. And when they put titles on them, they put titles on them eventually. They're according to. Kata. Wow. So that would be for us, President Obama, according to Ed, President Obama, according to. Now, we probably would say, no, this is the way it is. You might say, no, this. We can always argue that our interpretations are facts. That's what we're doing at the moment. And eventually we have to deny truth to do that. But no, it's an interpretation. It doesn't make it wrong. Yeah. Because you can't not have interpretations. The uninterpreted fact is just irrelevant. Nobody cared enough about it. It's just so. The other big thing, which is much more important for me then, those 4. If I was reading, the New Testament, I knew nothing about it, I'd say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Oh, I got 4 accounts of this guy, Jesus. So these are probably like 4 witnesses, court of law. They're called in by the lawyer to tell about the accident. They all looked at it. And yeah, I can see a few differences in there. That's what you'd expect. If their story is exactly the same, that means they're copying. But then after the last 200 years of criticism, we began to realize they were copying. And a vast consensus of scholarship. I respect consensus of scholarship because that's a miracle. Scholars don't ever. So a vast consensus says Mark is the first of the Gospels written, and Matthew and Luke copied Mark. Now it's still, I would argue that John did too, by the way, but that's controversial. So I want to wait. Now that tells me if I draw up in parallel columns Matthew, Mark, and Luke, I can watch 2 of these guys changing Mark. How can they read their source and change it? What do they think they're doing? They're writing good news. So Matthew looks at Mark and says, well, that might have been fine for Jesus, maybe in the 30s. That might have been good news for him. That makes no sense to my people in the 80s or 90s. So I'm going to change. Now, I wouldn't do that. If I was writing the story, first of all, there wouldn't be 4, there'd only be 1. And I try to get it, but I respect the way they are. Now, that doesn't mean that when I write, let me give you an example. Mark says, for example, the crowd shouts, crucify him. The crowd, achlos in Greek. I go into Matthew and I'm watching Matthew following Mark, and I watch the way he changes it. All of a sudden, the crowd in Mark becomes the crowds, plural in Matthew. Crowds getting bigger. The culpability is expanding. Then a few times later, he says, all the people. Wow. He's taken a crowd shouting crucifixion. And we can ask how many is in a crowd when you're shouting to your governor. And I would say, not too many. And we had all the people. Now, I don't think for a second that Matthew has new archival data. He's expanding responsibility. And therefore, as a historian, I understand what he's doing. I understand why he's doing it. Maybe his opponents in the 80s or 90s are saying equally bad things about him. But I read it the same way as I hear one newscast as distinct from another newscast telling me what's going on. I know enough to know who might be pro and who might be anti, and I understand the same way you read editorials. So the crucial thing for the Gospels is first to accept them as they are, to take the fact that whether you like them or not, and I'm talking now to people for whom these are inspired texts, okay, then they're inspired copying. Or if you want to use it, inspired plagiarism. If Matthew did to Mark today, writing for the New York Times, what he did in the first century, he would be fired for plagiarism. Unless he quoted Mark and says, Mark says this, but of course he should have said that because now that doesn't apply. And if I bring this up to date, here's the way we put it today. Fine, fine, fine. Now, if we don't like that, too bad, because that's the way it is. I wouldn't have expected, let me put it in the middle of the 2nd century, Marcion looked at the 4 and said, got to reduce these to 1. And then another person said, well, could we get all 4 of them and make a sort of a fourfold gospel? You know, bit of this, bit of that, bit of John, and have a nice big, like the old Life of Christ.
Little variety, yeah.
No problem, you know, a little bit of John, a little bit. You could have the like our crib at Christmas. You know, you could get the wise men in there along with the shepherds side by side holding arms. Everyone's happy. We got Matthew and Luke in there. No problem. That's not respectful. I mean, I don't do that. I would say I want to know what Mark is doing. I know why. I want to know. And the way I do it is I don't start with them. At the back of my mind, I look at history. I want to know what's going on in the 1st century, in the Roman Empire, in the Romanization of the Jewish homeland and the diaspora. That's like growing up, you know, and reading Irish history. I have to read it as the British are here. The British are here. They're not coming. They're here. I can't ignore that. It doesn't make any difference what I think about it. I have to say, well, this makes sense because they're reacting against this. So if I have to explain why Jesus was crucified, it makes absolute sense to me that he is, now my language is very careful, non-violent rebel against Roman law and order. How do I know that? Not because the Bible says anything. Forget that for the moment. Let me put it this way. The New Testament doesn't exist. Josephus exists, Tacitus exists. I see both of them talking about this weird group called Christians. They're trying to explain this at the end and beginning of the second century. Who are Christians? Well, they're a follower of this weird guy, Christ. Who's Christ? They both agree he started a movement over there in Judea. We executed him for it. But instead of his followers getting the message and taking off like they were supposed to, they all hung on and the whole thing expanded. Now, here's one thing that I want to tell you.
Yep.
In Roman law, if you were the leader of a rebel gang, let's call it a gang, that's what they'd call it. You'd be a freedom fighter, of course, if you're a Jew. But a rebel gang, they would grab the leader and as many of the top lieutenants in our language and crucify them in a row. So you'd see the whole thing as you're passing by, you'd know immediately these people had gone up as a group against Roman law and order. You know that because that's what's going to happen to Barabbas. He's in jail along with his buddies for insurrection. Jesus is crucified by Pilate, but none of his followers are rounded up. That is the crucial historical fact. I'm not taking that from the gospel. I'm taking it from Josephus and Tacitus. And they're only telling it because they want to explain who these weirdos are, Christians. Jesus is executed, but his followers aren't arrested or executed with him. By Roman law, and I can quote it from more or less memory, those who create a tumult among the people, we might call them rabble rousers, must be according to their rank. This is the fascinating thing. Crucified, thrown to the wild beast, or exiled to an island. In other words, if you're an important aristocrat, we want. So just if I never had the New Testament and I cared enough to bother to wonder who this Christ weirdo is, I would know. He was the leader of nonviolent resistance against the Romanization of the Jewish homeland during the first years. It started, say, in 60 BCE. The Herodians took over, as you know. I would know that without anything from Jesus or the New Testament. And another thing I would know, actually, not that Jesus invented that, because it's all over Josephus that there were Jews experimenting with nonviolent resistance, as well as Jews, of course, who in 4 BCE and 66 led violent revolts against Rome. But in that lull between the two great revolts, disastrous revolts, of course, they experimented with nonviolent resistance backed up by martyrdom. So Jesus fits absolutely into the Jewish world of his time. Now, you make that into a theology, then you're making a claim that nonviolent resistance is not just a useful strategy against the Romans. You know, they won't know what to do with it, but that it is the divine will for the world. Mm-hmm. That's because that's what Jesus will say, that God brings, is nice to the just and the unjust. So Jesus's vision is of a nonviolent God, promoting, supporting. He may well be thinking of God as a person. I don't care about that. If he does, fine. Because I don't have a problem, by the way, with personifying natural forces. They do it all the time whenever a hurricane is heading for Florida. It's just a hurricane. It's not cruel. If it slaughters people, it's not a cruel hurricane. It's just a big hurricane. So I understand that we personify things. And I have no problem if people want to personify evolution. But to think it's a person out there is disastrous, I think.
All righty. Well, that was a very good answer to that question, sir. And so to conclude with one more question, very quickly, did you want to say whether you believe the original Gospel of Mark ended at chapter 16, verse 1 through 8, the short ending, or do you believe in the authenticity of the longer ending?
Okay, could I be very clear with your word believe? I don't want to make it could be wrong. For example, when I said to you that Matthew and Luke are copying Mark, that's not an act of faith. That's just an historical judgment. And if you said to me, could that be disproved? Oh, yeah. You come up with me a nice big parchment fragment, now hopefully not a fraud, parchment fragment that's dated around 50. And I got a little piece of Mark, a little piece of Matthew, a little piece of Jude. And I'm looking at the source they all got. Oh, yeah. I would change like overnight when I saw that and was certain. Let's say it was written on something that couldn't be debated and wasn't fraud. So yeah, that could be falsified. So it looks to me as an historical judgment that Mark, because of how I understand Mark, inevitably had to stop without any apparitions.
Oh, okay.
Because Paul had already written 1 Corinthians 15.
Oh, yeah, well,
he talks about appeared to James, appeared to me, all that. So I don't presume Mark didn't know, Mark didn't know that, but Mark has spent his whole gospel. And by the way, I consider that Mark was written, you have to have an idea of what Mark's gospel is to know whether the ending is good or bad, as I would have if I'm watching something on television and it stops. I turned to Sarah and said, that's it, it's over. And then we're trying to figure out, but what happened to him? Oh, I get it. It was all a dream, something like that. Okay. So I have to go into Mark and say, why would Mark end like that? Mark is writing, as I understand, right after or in the throes of the Great War of 66 to 74. He's writing, I think, for refugees from that war. He's writing around the villages of Caesarea Philippi in the Transjordanian regions. That's why I think he's writing for them. They've lost everything and almost lost their faith. That's why he spends so much time in chapter 13 explaining to them that Jesus didn't say that he would reappear when the temple was being destroyed, because that's what they thought, the last hope. He also has to tell them that he doesn't accept what Peter and the family have been saying, their whole Jerusalem theology, you might have said. They should have got out of there. They were supposed to leave. So the last message from Jesus is get out of Jerusalem, get back to Galilee to see him. They didn't do it, and look what happened. He couldn't end up with Peter having visions, because he spent the whole thing saying Peter's a kind of a failure. Well, he denied me, he was forgiven. But Matthew, of course, would write totally different. For Matthew, Peter is the hero of everything.
Yeah.
Not for Paul, by the way, as you remember. Paul called him a hypocrite twice.
Yeah, call him out to his face.
Mark doesn't think much of Peter. He doesn't think much of the inner three, Peter, James, and John, who always get it wrong. And he doesn't think much of the 12, because one of them is Judas. So basically, he's going to end by saying, they never got the message. Get out of Jerusalem, get back to Galilee, and start from there. That's a theological statement. It's an indictment. It makes absolute sense to me as I understand Mark. So I don't have to say, why on earth would he end? Then when I turn to Matthew, I watch Matthew following Mark, and I know before I get there, because I know what he said about Peter and the rock, there's no way he can end this gospel without the message getting to Peter. So of course, there's Jesus talking to the apostles in Galilee. Of course. If you understand the dynamics between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you could actually, how would I put it, prescribe. I can almost expect what John is going to do with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He's going to put Jesus in charge of his own crucifixion. He's going to have Jesus up on the cross almost saying, you know, you can almost see Mount Tabor from up there. Doesn't sound like he's suffering, doesn't sound like he's in pain. He's just, you know, setting up domestic arrangements. And then he says at the end, okay, I think everything is done now. I'm out of here. John describes Jesus running his own crucifixion. He is like, how do you crucify God? Well, very carefully. That's not Mark. That's not Matthew. So you have to respect their individuality. And when you do that, now, if you're an adolescent, you could say, they disagree. You know, but most of us got over our adolescence around, 16 or 17, when you're thrilled to find, a mistake. And they don't say the same thing. Of course, they don't say the same thing. They're changing one another. So basically, that's the way I see it.
All right.
To answer your question, yep, he stopped at 16:8. And what we're asking now is exactly good other people saying, yeah, but where are the visions? Where are the apparitions to the apostles? Where does he tell them you're in charge? This is no way.
Angel.
Yeah, this is no way of running a church. Then along comes Paul, and he announces that Jesus has appeared to me from heaven, and I'm an apostle just like you guys.
Yeah,
they must have been tearing out our. That's like if the Roman Catholic Church has just had a convocation, and a new pope has been announced, and some bishop announced, I have a revelation from God, and he's made me a pope. Well, if you can vote him down, of course, but if you're starting off, what are you going to do with Paul, who can have a vision and be an apostle? Well, why couldn't somebody else? And oh Lord, it might even be a woman. How do we control this church? We're all about power and control, and that's why Luke at the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles says the only one that can be an apostle is somebody who was with us from the time of John the Baptist until now. So goodbye, Paul. You can never be an apostle. So we elect one of the males, and he puts it in, not men, but one of the males. So if you watch what they're doing, oh Lord, it makes awful sense.
Yeah.
Anything else?
All righty. Well, that's it. Thank you very much for answering those questions. And after this interview, I'll give you a YouTube version in about an hour, so you'll have it the same day. And you can feel free to repost, reshare it. You can do whatever you like with it. And before we end the interview, do you have any final remarks for anyone, any of your fans or anything?
I would say to really, I'm going to put it this way, please take evolution seriously. If you believe, if you're a theist and you believe in a personal God who's a super being, I would still ask you, then your super being ran the thing through evolution. Okay?
Now there's theistic evolution.
Your super being. So when Paul, for example, says you want to look at God, look at Christ or creation, cross out creation and put in evolution. Because it wasn't like that. It really wasn't. We could talk about Genesis 1 again. It really wasn't. So take evolution seriously, because if you don't, you won't take what we're doing to the world seriously. You won't take justice, distributive justice seriously. We will destroy the world. And if you think that is the will of your superpower God, who's just going to evacuate us then to heaven, please remember what happened to the Titanic.
Yeah.
We're on the Titanic. We see the iceberg straight ahead.
Yeah.
And we've more than enough time. Well, I think we've more than enough time still to backpedal, not to veer
all but the other way.
Backward, because if we hit it on one side, we'll rip it apart.
Yeah.
So the best thing to do with time is go into full reverse, even if you hit it head on. So take evolution seriously. I would say that to theists or atheists. That's a more important thing than arguing, actually, honestly, about theism or atheism.
All righty, sir. Well, thank you very much for making time today. And like I said, I'll give you the uploaded version on YouTube of this very soon.
All right. Thank you very much, Ed. Over and
All right.
out. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, sir.